I'm going to talk about a new book that it literally just came out last week that my co-conspirator, Huggy Rao, and I, we spent, I think, 8 years on this thing, and it's the Friction Project. And let me set a little context for us here. So there's Huggy and I. For locals from the Bay Area, we're actually, the Dumbarton Bridge is above us. And we had a crazy photographer. And so the reason we got interested in this friction stuff, to give you some context, is for about 15 years, we've been studying a topic that I think, from talking to people at the Tugboat Institute, is something that all of you CEOs, all your teams sort of struggle with every day, which is leading at scale. So for us, scale has 3 different parts. One, and this is our 2014 book on the subject. One is how you grow the thing. The second, we just heard a culture talk, how you spread something good throughout an existing system. And then the third thing, which as we started working with companies that grew, as they got larger and more complex and older, things got harder. That's how we got interested in friction in large part. It just is a slight digression, but I think it's important. Sometimes people think, oh, if I've got a giant company like Google, I have a lot of students who work at Google now, it's very difficult to get things done there. It's more bureaucratic than almost any organization I know. It's really a big problem. But then even in little organizations, I've had students who have started a company with 3 people, and they have 15 people, and they realize they've got to manage differently with 15 people, for example, to break them into teams. So those are sort of the main areas, and along the way, we got interested in this notion that, well, why are things so hard to do in organizations? And that's what kind of got us going on this topic. So what we would call bad friction, it fuels frustration, it fuels despair, emotional withdrawal, and just to give you a little flavor, and maybe some of this happens in your organization, it certainly happens in mine at Stanford. Bain, the big consulting firm, they had a client that they figured out, this is kind of big company, they had the senior team meet once a week, but I think all of us know, especially if you've been part of a large, complex organization, when the senior team meets, everybody has to help them get ready. And this is not the time in the meeting. People spent 300,000 hours a year helping the senior team get ready. And Bain helped them cut it by about 25%, which isn't bad. Another example, and there's a lot of talk, I'm not gonna say anything political, but there's a lot of talk about how much red tape there is in government. Like all sides of the political aisle talk about that. One of my favorite examples, or least favorite, was in the state of Michigan. There used to be, and that's the key part, we're gonna get to the solution here, there used to be a form for when people needed benefits from the state of Michigan, healthcare, money, food. There was this form, 42 pages long, 1,000 questions, 18,000 words, and this is my favorite question: when was your child conceived? Now, I don't know about you, I have 3 children. I think I know when one of them was conceived, but I don't know about the other one. Okay, so speaking of my children, my daughter, when she got her first job, this is an example also of what they call app overload. So she was working as a customer service rep for a company called Color. She still works there. And she showed me her laptop, and she had 13-inch laptop, 15 apps open all at the same time, and 20 open screens. And this idea of sort of the overload that comes with, and this is one of the problems that we talk about. Okay. So this is the kind of stuff that got us interested in doing a book on this topic. And I love this. This is an HP manager. She said, I'm swimming in a sea of shit. I'm just trying to stay afloat. They want me to show initiative, but it's impossible. Okay. So I can relate to this. We all can do it. But so this sort of brought us, and I was talking backstage actually to Ryan and saying, the advantage that I have compared to probably almost everybody in this room is I don't have a real job. Honestly, being a tenured professor, we have so much privilege, it's ridiculous. And so maybe too much, some people would say. So Huggy and I, we spent 8 years trying to figure out this friction problem. So we did case studies, we went through academic research, we did some academic research. I had a podcast, of course. And we worked with some companies to try to make things better. And fortunately, I also know a lot of smart senior executives who gave us advice. So that's what we did. And this is the one-sentence summary of the book. The best leaders are trustees of others' time. They're friction fixers who make the right things easier and the wrong things harder. And so there's two little messages there in addition to the bad news. The first good news is that there's actually something you can do about this. The second good news is that, I don't know, it's good news, but it was a surprise to us. There's some things that should be difficult in life. So let's talk about an example of a friction fixer, somebody who was a great trustee of others' time. All of us in the United States who have been to the doctor know they spend more time looking at the screen than looking us in the eye. This is because of something called electronic health records, which in theory is a good thing because when you go from one doctor to another, you don't have to give them your whole life history, even though they ask for it anyways. So there was a woman, Dr. Melinda Ashton. This article's from the Journal of American Medical Association, very respected journal. And so she was upset because their electronic medical system, and this was in Hawaii Pacific, the biggest system in the state of Hawaii, was taking a bunch of time. So she did something called the Gross Get Rid of Stupid Stuff campaign, and her team got a bunch of suggestions. They got 188 suggestions, you can see, 87 improvements, and you can just see at the bottom here, there was one little click that every nurse assistant had to make during rounds. They eliminated that one little click. That saved 24 seconds and 1,700 hours per month at the 4 hospitals. And to me, this is a good example of what a friction fixer does, is she set up a system where it made things just a little bit easier. Now the other side, remember the surprise that we came up with, and we should have known this as behavioral scientists, but the data smacked us in the face anyways, that the best friction fixers also know when to slow down and make things harder. So one of the analogies we use is kind of the gas and the brakes. So this is Noam Barden. How many of you use the Waze application? So Waze was kind of a company founded in Israel in about 2011, but the main market was the US market. And Noam noticed in 2013, after his team got $30 million in Series B funding, that once people downloaded Waze, if you waited 30 days, hardly anybody was using it. So the venture capitalists give them the money, and what venture capitalists do, some of you probably work with venture capitalists, is they want you to hire a bunch of people and do a bunch of product development right away. But what Noam figured out was that, well, actually, the product was so screwed up that he just stopped everything. And what he had people do was to spend 6 full weeks and to figure out, well, what's wrong with this thing? So they did quantitative and qualitative analysis. They did no hiring. He just hit the brakes until he figured out what was wrong with it. And then they started hiring people and doing product development. And he was under a lot of pressure not to do that. And so we think of this analogy. There's sometimes when things are all messed up, you just got to put in the friction and slow things down no matter what people are telling you. So that's another example of friction fixing. So if you kind of think of this motto, and we have a bunch of mottos in the book about people who are trustees, there's 2 in particular I would focus on. And one thing I like, we have here at Tugboat, we have the CEOs, and we have your teams. This is not just for CEOs. If you're a trustee, you do what you can with what you have to make things better for the people in your cone of friction. And one of my favorite examples in the book is an example of an employee at the Department of Motor Vehicles in the state of California. And we all know how bad it is in every state to visit the DMV. This guy, I get in line, and I think I'm going to be there for hours. 60 people in front of me. He walks down the line, asks each of us while we're there. Some people he tells they can't be there today. Other people he gives forms to fill out. And I was out in 30 minutes. Which is still absolutely shocking to me. And what he was a trustee of people's time within his cone of friction. Now we're doing a case study with the California Department of Motor Vehicles to see, well, they're making things better. And also there's this notion, it's like mowing the lawn. If you just do a friction fixing effort or a subtraction effort for one day, that's not enough. So that's some of our mottos. So what I'm going to do in my 15 minutes or so I have left is to talk about some on-ramps. You'll see in the book, there's a bunch of different on-ramps for friction fixers. I think that these 2 might be the most important, but maybe not. All right, so the first one is addition sickness. So this is the notion, it's the penchant to solve problems by making them more complicated by adding stuff. If you are a human being, and I only see human beings here, it turns out that we have been evolved to solve problems, like let's go to Leidy Klotz's research on subtract, by adding more complexity. And so Leidy Klotz wrote this great book, Subtract, and I've done some work with him. And what Leidy's research shows is essentially almost any problem that you give us, fixing a Lego model, fixing a university, a recipe, if you ask people to make it better, they just add more stuff. And there's probably an evolutionary basis for this, that the people who hoarded all the food are probably the people who are our ancestors and survived. So there's probably an evolutionary basis. So that's one problem. The other problem, so we're wired that way. The other problem is, from what I can tell, not all, but most organizations have what economists call perverse incentives for people who add rather than subtract. And I've got a whole list here. The one that, well, is doing really bad things to Google right now and to my own university, Stanford, and this is not a secret, is a lot of organizations, independently of the value, the bigger fiefdom that you build, the more people who work for you, the more you get paid. And then, of course, when you have bigger fiefdoms, let's just say in accounting, that those are people who create work for other people in the organization to justify their existence. So, and in most organizations, and the Stanford University, Google, this is the way it is. In most organizations, the people who subtract and don't add in the first place don't get rewarded. Okay. And then there's the George Carlin effect. I love this. My shit is stuff, your stuff is shit. So we all know that our pet project, our pet, what is it, movement, it's really important and everybody should do it, so we keep adding software. For years, I would plead guilty to being involved in the design thinking movement, and I believed that design thinking was the cure for absolutely everything until I learned it was good, but not for everything. Okay, so how do you reverse addition sickness? This is my pal Michael Deering, early stage venture capitalist, more than 200 companies, probably Harry's Razors you might have heard of, for example. His basic argument is the best leaders, essentially they act like film and book editors, that they cut out all the bad stuff, to go through this slide quickly. So what are some of the ways that we've seen the companies actually do this? One is by using simple subtraction rules, just simple rules that make it hard to add. A good example of this is Laszlo Bock, when he was head of HR at Google for about 8 years. They had a norm, which went way back to the beginning, that if you were going to interview an employee for a new job, you do 5, 10, 15, as many as 25 interviews. What Laszlo did, he basically stopped it by putting in a simple rule that if you were going to do more than 4 interviews, you had to write me. I kind of like that one. That's a simple one. Another one, this is one I was involved in, one of my favorite students, Rebecca Hines. She's now head of something called the Asana Work Innovation Lab. What Rebecca did was she led an effort at Asana where essentially, to sort of cut to the chase, she got 60 employees in marketing to rate every standing meeting on how important it was and how much trouble it was. And then she helped them sort of trim the meetings. Some they got rid of, some they made shorter, some they made less often. And the average employee saved about 4 hours a month. So that's a subtraction tool you might be able to use in your organization. We wrote it up in HBR if you want to see it. And then the star was a woman named Francesca who saved 32 hours a month. So somebody really did something interesting. Another method, which is kind of a fun little thing that we've done with a lot of groups. If we had time, we could do it right now. It's essentially you turn to the person next to you and you talk about the thing that's driving you most crazy in your organization and talk about getting rid of it. And sometimes it's really big things, maybe unrealistic. Sometimes people want to get rid of HR, which is not a good idea. Sometimes it's a little thing, but we've had experiences where, for example, one EVP, he killed a bad project. Another CTO, he just made his weekly meeting every 2 weeks. But that's one of the other things that we suggest doing, is just running the subtraction game in your organization. Then there's organizations that have subtraction movements, some more system-wide efforts. To go back to that form in Michigan that I was so concerned about, there was this amazing guy named Michael Brennan who got obsessed with it. He already had some connection to Michigan. And he put together a team, And he worked with the state of Michigan, he worked with employees, he worked with the unions and so forth. And now there's a new form. And it's 80% shorter. It's 42% faster for staff to do. And you can see there's an increase in applicants and fewer visits to the office because people aren't confused. So it actually is possible, even in the state of Michigan, to cut something by 80%. So I love that story. It's very well documented. You can find it everywhere. Then there's people in corporations who lead subtraction movements. This is one of the case studies we did. This woman, Pushkala, led this at AstraZeneca. It was a top-down and bottom-up movement, so there was top-down stuff. For example, AstraZeneca is a very large international decentralized pharmaceutical firm, and there was a lot of times when people would get to the new job and they wouldn't have their laptop or software working for weeks. That's a very bad experience for lots of reasons. So they standardized that and centralized that so it was good for everyone. And then there was a lot of bottom-up stuff. They had these people that they called simplification champions all over the world that led little local efforts, such as getting rid of paperwork, getting rid of unnecessary meetings. Okay, that's the first one. The second one, which is the most fun, and I love this term, jargon monoxide. So this is bad and sometimes good friction that's caused by hollow or impenetrable language. So let's give you some example. There's a huge academic literature on bullshit. I can't believe, if you put bullshit in the internet, it's amazing how many scholars I know are doing respectable research on bullshit. So here's Andre Spicer. He's the dean of a business school in England. So he defines it as empty and misleading communication crafted to serve the bullshitter's purpose. And if you can tell me what Deepak Chopra is saying here, I want to know. This line has actually been used in academic studies as an example of bullshit, to ask people, what does this mean? By the way, the dumber people are and the more rigid their beliefs, the more likely they are to believe in bullshit. Imagination is inside exponential space-time events. So at the break, I want somebody to translate this for me. The solution for jargon monoxide in general, bullshit in particular, is to stop and force yourself to flush the old one, embrace that editor-in-chief role. One of my favorite people, and I don't mean to say anything bad about consulting firms, but this was a firm that had been going on for a long time, and the CEO, she decided she needed a COO to kind of take charge of things, and they hired a woman who had only ever worked in a consulting firm, and the poor staff had no idea what the hell this person was saying. So a stubborn staff member started keeping a dictionary and would force, terms like pressure test and synergy, and force the person to define it, okay? And they got rid of about half of this foul language. All right. Then there's in-group lingo. This is like the jargon that comes within, within sort of like a group. In-group lingo is not all bad. It's really nice, for example, that your doctor can say stat MI, which means move fast, somebody's having a heart attack, but sometimes it's incomprehensible. And there's a really interesting example of this with ChatGPT. This was just published about a month ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, the AI part. What they did was they took the patient consent form, and this is the largest healthcare system in the state of Rhode Island, and they ran it through the prompt. You can see the whole prompt was, while preserving content in meaning, convert this consent form to the average American's reading level. By the way, the average American's reading level is about in the 6th grade, if you don't know that, which is sad but true. And so what they did was they converted this form to the 7th grade level, and now 35,000 patients a year are using a much simpler consent form. So that's subtraction, since they made it shorter, and also cleaning up jargon monoxide. Okay, I've got 5 minutes. I always try to finish on time. We'll see how I do. So I've been talking about bad friction. Constructive friction is something that we're actually quite obsessed with. It's all over the chapter. The best piece we've written about constructive friction was actually in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago, if you want to look it up. The first time when friction is important is when you have a really complex problem. It's really important to slow down and figure it out before you act. And so I was a psychology major, I was an organizational psychologist for decades, and they always taught us on IQ tests that smart people do everything faster. But there's actually some new research, and I won't go through, they did fMRIs and all this sort of stuff. There's some new research out of Germany that essentially shows that people with higher IQs do solve simple problems faster, but they solve complex problems slower because they figure out what the heck is going on before they act, so they solve them better. So I kind of like that analogy. You can be smart and slow. An example was project reform, which I already talked about. Michael Brennan spent an amazing amount of time with the bureaucrats at the state of Michigan, developing this idea about planting many seeds, developing a bunch of different prototypes, rolling it out among the staff, talking with the residents who needed it. Oh, and also, there's 1,700 pages of rules and regulations they had to comply to, so the new form it still hasn't resulted in any litigation. So that's an example of sort of slowing down to win. Another thing, and Robert said this beautiful about planting seeds. I loved all his examples of actually the products that he tried that failed rather than succeeded. Just as somebody who's been involved in studying, working with organizations that do creative work for decades, I can't figure out how to make the process more efficient. There are some ways to make it less inefficient, and I have time for this. There's sort of a history in Disneyland. Some of you may know there's something called Imagineering in Burbank, California, where they do a lot of the innovation. About every 10 or 12 years, some Disney executive gets upset with how much they screw up and how inefficient they are, and put somebody in charge of it to make it more efficient. They always fail. And so this idea, this was from Teresa Mablé, who spent 50 years studying creativity, that essentially when creativity gets under the gun, you're in trouble. And Robert's idea of planting seeds is, to me, that's what a great innovator do. The most successful innovators tend to have the most failures. And if you want an example of this, Jerry Seinfeld, he'll try 130, 140 jokes to get 7 or 8 that work. All right, my last one. So in the book, we quote the Supremes here, you can't hurry love. It turns out that yes, it is possible to do relatively good work with strangers or people you barely know. A lot of times some of us do that. The people who are flying our planes often have just met. But if you look at research on what the most effective teams are in a whole bunch of different settings, it's people who have prior joint experience, people who have worked together a lot and know each other well. And I've got Warren and Charlie. Unfortunately, Charlie just passed away. They worked together since 1965. You look at the academic research, founding teams that are composed of people who've worked together before, they do better. So just from Stanford, if you look at a lot of the companies that were founded from Stanford, Hewlett and Packard worked together as students. Larry and Sergey, who founded Google, worked together as students. So this idea of it takes a long time to sort of have the teams work together. So that's sort of my last one about if you have too much efficiency and don't slow down to form the relationship, especially among teams that have a lot of impact, you're probably going to fail. So the best leaders are trustees of others' time. That's the headline. They focus on making the right things easier and the wrong things hard. So think of yourself as a trustee. And I don't just mean the CEOs in this room, I mean everybody else. And a closing point, and I think I say this at the end of almost everything, I always worry that when somebody like me, who's supposed to be a management expert, a lot of us, we only know so much, your jobs are very hard, we will sometimes pretend we are giving you advice that's going to work and it's going to be simple and easy. That's always a lie. Everything that I know about what it takes to lead and run an organization of any size is at best, it's a manageable mess. So this is Clara Shai, maybe the smartest Stanford undergraduate I ever met. She was first in computer science. She wrote a best-selling book about making the argument that social media would matter for business when she was 28. New York Times bestseller. And I could go on and on. Now she's CEO of AI at Salesforce, and I won't read you the whole quote because that's kind of boring, but Clara basically says when she's launching something new, you have to be ready to expect it to be messy and for things to go wrong. And she does one other thing in my final 10 seconds. This is really cool. She calls it separation of concerns. She has one group, and she says, you're the people who we're assuming things are going right. Okay, so you just keep, but then there's the team to the cleanup on aisle 9 team. These are the people who clean things up when it goes wrong, and they know things are gonna go wrong, they just don't know what it is. Okay, I'm 30 seconds over, so I'm gonna shut up. It was great to talk to you, and I look forward to hanging out with you folks in the breaks, and thank you very much, that was really fun.